Most lost cities leave only ruins, broken stone, scattered ash, a wall or two for the wind. This one left a watch, stopped at the exact minute it died. In the summer of 1692, one of the richest and most lawless towns in all the Americas stood crowded onto a thin spit of Caribbean sand, a place that churches called the wickedest on earth, its brick mansions stuffed with Spanish silver and stolen gold. Its name was Port Royal. Then, on one bright June morning, the ground beneath it turned to water.
I'm Arthur, and the sea has been keeping it ever since.
Jamaica, in the year 1655, a green island England has just torn from the Spanish crown and barely knows what to do with. Reaching out from its southern shore is a long, low tongue of sand and broken coral, the palisados, curling for miles across the mouth of a great bay. It is a strange, shifting thing, this spit, but it does one priceless trick. It wraps an arm around the water behind it and makes one of the finest, safest harbors in the entire world. Deep enough for the largest warship to moor with her hull almost touching the shore, sheltered enough to ride out a hurricane. On the very tip of that sandbar, guarding the narrow mouth of the harbor, the English began to build. They had a problem, and the sandbar seemed to answer it. Jamaica was a small prize, far from home, ringed by a Spanish empire that wanted it back, and England could spare no fleet to defend it. So the island's governors struck a bargain that would have horrified London a generation later. They threw the harbor open to the sea raiders of the Caribbean, the Buccaneers, and handed them slips of paper called letters of marque, licenses to plunder Spanish ships and Spanish towns, all in the name of the crown. The pirates became the island's navy. In return, they were given somewhere to spend what they took. And what they took was a flood. On that tongue of sand, with the deep blue harbor on one side and the open sea on the other, a town rose with astonishing speed. But the same sand that made the harbor so perfect was loose and wet and lay only a few feet above the waves. No one buys a sandbar thinking about the ground beneath it. They were thinking about the gold, and the gold was already on its way in.
By the 1660s, Port Royal had become the storehouse and treasury of the West Indies.
And to stand on its wharves was to stand at one of the great crossroads of the world. The harbor was a forest of masts, Spanish sloops, English frigates, Dutch traders, the long, low ships of the Buccaneers, more than 20 deep-water vessels riding at anchor at once. Onto the quays came a cargo list that read like a map of the whole earth. Chinese porcelain packed in straw, bales of Indian cotton, English tools and Madeira wine, and chest after chest of Spanish silver coin, the famous pieces of 8, prized from the holds of captured ships. Most of that silver did not come from honest trade. It was plunder. And the man who turned plunder into an industry was a Welsh buccaneer named Henry Morgan. Morgan led whole fleets of sea raiders against the richest ports of the Spanish Main, and the numbers were staggering. A single raid on Portobello in 1668 is said to have brought back booty worth around £75,000. By some accounts, several times the value of everything the island's sugar plantations sold in a year. 3 years later, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama and burned its capital city to the ground, the greatest prize of the age. And here the story turns strange. That raid had broken a fresh peace treaty with Spain, and to soothe Madrid, Morgan was arrested and shipped home to London. He was not punished, he was celebrated, knighted by the king himself, and sent straight back to Jamaica as its lieutenant governor, now charged with hunting down the very pirates he had once led. Sugar was the slow road to wealth. Port Royal had found the fast one. But the trade that built the town was not only silver and porcelain. Through that same harbor passed another commerce entirely. Port Royal was one of the great slave markets of the English Caribbean. Ships came in from the African coast and unloaded their captives into the heat to be sold on to the plantations or kept to labor in the town itself. By the time of our story, perhaps 2 in every 5 people in Port Royal were enslaved Africans, and much of the wealth that dazzled every visitor rested on their forced and unpaid labor. All of it flowed into a single square mile of brick and sand. Land on Port Royal's waterfront grew as dear as land in the heart of London, and the men who held it spent like princes.
And spend they did. Port Royal earned a second title, one the clergyman spat rather than spoke.
The wickedest city on earth, the Sodom of the New World. It was a name the town worked hard for. When a buccaneer fleet came in heavy with silver, the money rarely lasted the week. There were stories of raiders who would buy a great cask of wine, roll it into the street, and stand over it, pressing every passerby to drink. By one reckoning, a full quarter of the buildings in town were taverns, gaming houses, or brothels. The colony licensed taverns by the dozen. In a single month of 1661, 40 new licenses at once, and that counted only the legal ones. Between every pair of licensed houses stood an unlicensed rum room, until the townsfolk liked to boast there was a drinking spot for every 10 souls who lived there. Their drink of choice was a raw, barely aged rum so brutal, the islanders gave it its own name. They called it Kill Devil. And yet, for all its sin, this was no shantytown of tents and mud. Port Royal looked like a slice of an English city set down in the tropics. Brick houses of 3 and 4 stories stood along paved streets with names brought from home: High Street, Queen Street, Thames Street. Their ground floors opened as shops and counting rooms. Goldsmiths turned captured silver into plate. Warehouses bulged. Cannon lined the forts along the water. 6,500 people crowded into a space a man could walk across in minutes, one of the most densely packed patches of ground on the planet. And it was, above all, a working harbor. The docks never emptied. Shipwrights and sailmakers patching the battered vessels that limped in from months at sea. Wherrymen rowing passengers across the bay. Porters and enslaved laborers hauling the endless tide of crates and casks and coin. Sailors under every flag crowded the streets. English, Dutch, Portuguese, French. And money changed hands in a dozen tongues at once. Yet for all its riches, the town could not feed or water itself. There were no good wells on the sandbar. Fresh water came in by the barrel, and careless newcomers were soon doubled over with fever. Almost everything on a Port Royal table had been carried in by ship. Beef and pork brought in live and slaughtered the same day, and turtle, cheap and plentiful, hauled from the sea by the boatload to feed the crowds. It was a city that imported its own survival, one tide at a time. It was loud and rich and lit until dawn, and every tavern, every counting house, every 4-story mansion of imported brick rested on the same low tongue of wet sand. The town had built itself a copy of London on a sandbar. In time, the sandbar would be asked to hold it up.
The flaw ran underneath everything, and the town had taught itself not to look at it.
The peninsula was not rock, it was sand and gravel and old coral, loosely packed, soaked through with seawater, lifting only a little above the tide, solid enough to carry a fishing village. But the merchants had not built a fishing village. They had stacked thousands of tons of brick and timber and stone, 3 and 4 stories into the Caribbean sky, on ground with no more grip than a wet beach. The sea had given its warnings. Small tremors had rattled the island before. The ground would shudder and settle, and the town would shrug and go back to its accounts. There were those who saw something darker coming. The minister of Port Royal, the Reverend Emmanuel Heath, preached that a place so given over to vice could not stand forever. And afterwards, men swore his last sermon had sounded less like a warning than a prophecy. To the Puritans of the northern colonies and to the pamphleteers of London, Port Royal was a standing scandal, a town begging for judgment. Whether God was listening, no one can say. The ground had reasons of its own. One of the town's own legends had already been laid to rest in its sandy soil. Sir Henry Morgan, pirate, knight, and lieutenant governor, all in a single life, had died in his bed in 1688 and was buried with full honors and the thunder of cannon in the cemetery out on the sand. He had 4 years of quiet beneath it. He would not be left there. On the morning of the 7th of June, 1692, none of this was on anyone's mind. It was hot and bright and ordinary. The harbor lay flat and blue. Merchants opened their ledgers, and a little before noon, the ground drew its first long breath.
It is almost midday on Thames Street. Feel the heat coming off the brick, the glare from the water.
The clink of pewter through an open tavern door, the rumble of a cart on the paving stones, the ordinary noise of the richest town in the Americas going about its business. Then the gulls go up off the rooftops all at once, and the stones beneath your feet begin to move. The first shock is a low roll, like a wave passing under the street. People stop, glance at one another, half laugh. The second is harder, and the laughter dies. And then the third comes, and the ground stops behaving like ground at all. This was the thing the merchants had never understood about their sandbar. The town stood on loose, water-soaked sand, and when that sand was shaken hard enough, the water rose between its grains until it lost all its firmness and began to move like a liquid. The paved streets rolled in waves and split open in long cracks that gaped and slammed shut. The proud 4-story houses of brick did not topple over. They sank, sliding straight down into ground gone soft as porridge, some to the upper windows, some out of sight entirely as the sand closed over the top. Whole streets along the waterfront slid bodily into the harbor. By later accounts, in barely 2 minutes, the greater part of the town, wharves, warehouses, mansions, and all, had gone under the water. The Reverend Heath, who lived to write it down, described it without flourish. "I saw the earth open and swallow a multitude of people," he wrote, "and the sea mounting in upon us over the fortification. For the sea came in to take whatever the sand had opened. As the ground dropped away, the harbor rushed over it, and out on that water lay a frigate of the Royal Navy, HMS Swan, careened on her side for repairs, riding high with her ballast removed. The wave lifted the warship bodily over the rooftops of the drowning town and set her down, upright and almost whole, in the middle of the wreckage, where she became the unlikeliest of lifeboats, as survivors clawed out of the water and up onto her decks. In the harbor, more than 20 anchored ships were rolled over like toys. Of the 3 forts that had guarded all that wealth, 2 slid beneath the harbor and were gone. Only Fort Charles, on higher and firmer ground, kept its place. And in the middle of the chaos, one man lived through a thing so strange it was later carved onto his tomb. Louis Galdi, a French merchant, felt the ground take him, pull him whole into a fissure in the earth, and then a second shock heaved the ground apart again and threw him out, up and clear into the sea, where he swam stunned and alive until a boat pulled him from the water. The town had eaten him and spat him back. The harbor itself had become a nightmare of wreckage, the water thick with broken timber, with people clinging to anything that floated and to the masts of sunken ships that still stood up out of the shallows, calling for boats that wove between them, pulling out whom they could. And where the shaking died away, the liquefied sand was already settling and turning solid once more, sealing shut over everything it had taken. It was over in minutes. When the dust hung still and the water settled, 2/3 of Port Royal was simply gone. Not burned, not battered into rubble, but lowered whole into the harbor. Around 2,000 people died in those few minutes. Thousands more would follow in the days after, from injury and fever. The wickedest city on earth had been taken off the face of it almost between one breath and the next.
Every other dead city is granted the mercy of slow forgetting.
Its ruins weather, its stones are carried off. The grass comes, and the edges blur until what remains is a romantic outline and a guess. Port Royal was denied that mercy. The harbor closed over it like a lid and sealed it in cool, dark, airless mud. And the very disaster that destroyed the town is the reason we can still walk through it. Down in that quiet water stand brick walls, streets that still hold their plan, the small clutter of a single ordinary morning, pewter plates, clay pipes, the tools of trades that stopped where they lay. 3 centuries on, divers and archaeologists have mapped whole buildings down there room by room, a sunken city catalogued like the wreck of a great ship that happened to be a town. Whatever killed the city also embalmed it. And it left behind one detail no other lost city in the world can offer. When divers first searched the sunken town, among the silt they brought up a watch, a small pocket watch, its metal eaten thin by 3 centuries of sea, its hands resting near 17 minutes before 12. Whether they stopped in the first shock or were fixed there later by the slow grip of coral, no one can finally prove. But there it is, a drowned city that can name, almost to the minute, the hour of its own death. As for the man who ruled it, Sir Henry Morgan, the pirate turned knight, buried with cannon fire in the cemetery on the sand, his grave went down with the rest. The burying ground slid into the harbor in those same minutes, and Morgan's bones have never been found. The king of the wickedest city and the city itself went under together into the same blue water. The town was never truly rebuilt. Fire and hurricanes finished what the sea began, and across the bay a new port, Kingston, rose to inherit the trade. But under the fishing boats and the bright Caribbean light, the drowned town still holds the shape of that one ordinary morning. Its streets, its walls, the small unfinished business of a city that never reached noon. The sea swallowed Port Royal whole, and it has never let it go.
The story of Port Royal ends with a pocket watch stopped in the mud.
The story of New York begins with an actual wall that changed its skin over a century to become the capital of a nation. Watch the New York video to see history built layer by layer.
Subscribe and let's keep exploring. See you on the next journey.
Before we finish, I want to take a moment to recognize the people appearing on screen right now. To the members of this channel, thank you so much. Your ongoing support is what motivates me and helps keep this project alive. If you enjoy what we do here and would like to directly support the channel, I invite you to click the Join button down below. To our members and to everyone who is simply watching this video, thank you for your time.